Hello and welcome to another episode of the BeamG podcast. Today, let's define some terms. Story and narrative. What's the difference? Well, it's the way you tell it. Narrative is the choice of which events to relate and in what order to relate them. So it is a representation or a specific manifestation of the story, rather than the story itself. The easy way to remember the difference between story and narrative is to reshuffle the order of events. A new event order means you have a new narrative of the same story. Narrative turns story into information, or better, into knowledge for the recipient, for the audience or the reader. Each story event is a unit of knowledge the audience requires. A narrative is paradox because it seeks to convey truth by hiding it. A storyteller arranges the items of knowledge in such a way that they are revealed gradually, which implies initially obscuring the truth behind what is told. Such deliberate authorial obfuscation creates a sense of mystery or tension, and creates a desire in the audience to find out what is happening in the story and why. In this sense, a narrative is effectively the opposite of an account or a report. A report presents information in order to be understood by the audience immediately as it's being related. A neutral, matter-of-fact presentation probably maintains a chronology of events. It explains a state of affairs blow by blow and aims for maximum clarity at every stage. It seeks to convey truth by simply telling it. While the point of a narrative is also that the recipient perceives the truth of the story, in a narrative this truth is conveyed indirectly. Narrative is therefore responsible for how the recipient perceives the story. Let's look at a few different aspects. Some story basics, the components of story, and perhaps also text types that describe a story, and also author choices, such as genre, and quite importantly, point of view. And of course, once again, causality in narrative. So a few story basics. First of all, a story consists of narrated events. Events consist of actions carried out by characters. Characters are motivated. They have reasons for the things they do. There's conflict involved. One and the same story may be told in different ways, that is, have varying narratives. Note that we are talking here about narrative in the dramaturgical sense, not in the social sense. Like the term storytelling, the word narrative has become a bit of a buzzword. We are not referring here to open social narratives, such as the American narrative. We are pinpointing the use of the term for storytellers creating novels, films, plays, and the like. These tend in their archetypal form at least to be closed narratives with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A narrative may present the events of the story in linear, that is to say, chronological order, or it may not. But the story remains the story, even if it's told backwards. And that's the easy way to remember the difference between story and narrative. If you reshuffle the order of events, you are changing the narrative, the way you tell the story, and perhaps even its premise too, but you're not changing the story itself. Components of story. A story's events may be arranged as chronology or narrative. We know this when we're outlining a story. So let's take story as the hyperordinate term. Every story features characters that do something, and the total of these actions constitutes the plot. Plot consists of things that happen, i.e. events. These may be sorted into two different orders, the chronological sequence in time, and the order in which the author chooses to relate them, which is the narrative. A story may furthermore consist of two or several plots or subplots. Let's call these storylines, which tend to meet and intertwine. The events are what the characters do. They do these things because they are in interactions with each other. The interactions cause motivations. Essentially, these can be boiled down to three different categories of motivations or character interactions. The characters cooperate, may become allies. The characters are in conflict or oppose each other. Or the characters get together, form a unity or a romantic relationship. We'll examine these categories of relationships some of the time more closely. Let's have a look at text types that describe a story. That might help us get closer to the difference between story and narrative. One and the same story can be represented by different text types. So you've got like the story as a whole. You've got this thing called a step outline. You've got a treatment perhaps, a synopsis or a summary, or even a logline. All of these may be ascribed to the same work. They're different expressions of the same material. The logline and the synopsis describe the story without telling it, in one sentence or in a couple of paragraphs, respectively. They are typically included in project proposals or exposés. A treatment is a summary of the plot, including some of the most important events, but not necessarily all of them. Such a brief version of the story describes the same story as the full or finished version, but since this shorter version doesn't include the same amount of events, not all of them, it's not really the same narrative. Both synopsis and treatment, and in extreme cases perhaps even the logline, may point out how the narrative works, especially if it is not chronological. But neither actually contains the narrative of the story because neither includes a description of each and every event. Now, the step outline describes all the events of the story in narrative order, as a sort of shortened meta-version of the story itself. While a logline, a synopsis, a treatment, a step outline, and the finished work may all refer to the same story material, only the step outline and the finished work itself can express the same narrative of that story because they contain the same events without leaving any out. And of course, as liars know, leaving out bits of information can change the narrative. Let's look at a couple of choices that every author must make. An author has many, many choices. As we've seen already, an author has to decide on the narrative to be able to relate the story she has chosen to tell. Furthermore, the choice of genre influences the reception of the narrative. The same events can be turned into, say, a comedy or a thriller. Here the execution, or the way the story is told, determines how it is understood. Consider some examples. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove and Sidney Lumet's Failsafe use rather dissimilar narratives to tell effectively the same story that makes at least comparable points about the threat of nuclear war and how it may come about. The story of Lolita would be salacious, told by a lesser writer than Vladimir Nabokov. So it's the way you tell it. Perhaps the greatest influence on the way a story is perceived by the audience or reader is the author's choice of point of view. Point of view describes from which character's perspective the story is presented to the audience. Hardly any other author choice has as significant an effect on the narrative as point of view. Telling the same story from various points of view of the participating characters creates differing narratives. This is the famous Rashomon effect, named after a 1950 film by Akira Kurosawa, which was actually based on a story by Akutagawa, which was not called Rashomon. But anyway, 4 times the same occurrence is shown in the film, but as recounted by 4 participants. The 4 narratives have very different effects on the audience's understanding of the truth of what actually happened. So, such differences in understanding arise from the different motivations behind each character action, which we perceive differently due to the other point of view. Furthermore, one character may do something because she wants a particular result, but another character may ascribe completely different motivations to this same action, or observe different consequences to those actions. Even if the arrangement of the events is changed only very subtly, the chain of cause and effect is changed by the difference in point of view. Complicated? Let's look at causality in narrative. A chronology is essentially a list of events. It implies temporality. Between each event, you could insert the words "and then." The aim of a chronology is to report what happened, so it's essentially neutral. But as humans, our minds will look for reasons why the events happened. The chronology might yield such interpretations, or it might not. The juxtaposition of 2 scenes might seem to us to create meaning. When the audience experiences something, then the story cuts to another scene, and the audience will be looking for the connection. A narrative deliberately exploits the audience's tendency to look for connections and figure out significance. Narrative implies causality. In a narrative, you could insert between events the words "because of that." A narrative is an attempted explanation by an author, as well as an active interpretation by the audience. It carries meaning or a message, usually in form of a theme, which is brought home to the recipients or audience because they experience the narrative on an emotional level. How and why things occurred and how events relate to each other is what our minds are unceasingly trying to figure out. We look for agency or causality. As such, narrative is not only the choice of an author, but is a technique our minds use in order to seek to understand our perceptions of a complex world, be it a story world or a real world. When we frame and shape our perceptions into a narrative, we reduce the feeling of living in a chaotic world and thereby have a greater sense of control. You could therefore argue that story is tantamount to truth in that it ultimately remains equivocal. Story, like truth, is an illusion created by narrative.